This video looks at the formation of species, or a process called speciation. It's part of the evolution of organisms topic. So the key concepts here around how we actually define a species, and then some of the barriers that stop interspecies breeding going on, including lots of different reproductive isolating mechanisms, and then again that speciation and how it works. So when we talk about a species, we just need to be sure of what we're talking about here. So if we look at a big system of ecosystems, an ecosystem is a community of living things plus the non-living physical environment. So if we just look at the community, then the community is a group of different species, a number of different populations living together. Each population is a group of that same species made up of individuals. So a population is a group of individuals of the same species. But yeah, we still haven't quite defined what a species is yet. So often we think about a species as a whole lot of animals or organisms that look similar to each other. And so here we can see some butterflies that look similar, but actually sometimes that can be quite deceptive, because here is a different form, a seasonal form of that same species of butterfly that looks really different. And so sometimes those differences within a species are even greater than the differences between species. And we really see that with some of the animals that humans have bred. So for instance, animals like dogs and cats, especially dogs, the variety of different breeds of dog, they're all the same species, but physically they're quite different to each other. So we can't really use physical characteristics that well to define a species, although it can provide a bit of useful information. And that's kind of analysis we call morphology, the shape and colour and other physical characteristics. So even better though, we have genetic means of doing that, and so we'll talk about those a little bit later as well. But one of the key definitions of a species then, especially if it sexually reproduces, is organisms that can reproduce with each other to create fertile offspring are members of the same species, and if they can't reproduce to create fertile offspring, then they're not. So what are some of those barriers to reproduction? So we talk about them in two different ways. Pre-zygotic refers to the ones that stop sperm and egg even getting together before we can even form a zygote. And the post-zygotic is even if that sperm and egg do get together, that a fertile offspring won't be formed. So if they mate at different times, then there's no chance for the mating to happen. If they live in different areas and different habitats, then they're not going to mate together. If there are behavioural differences that mean that the males and females of those different species won't be attracted to each other, then that will also stop mating. And just mechanical means, if there's physically no way to get those two together, then that's a barrier to any reproduction. Even if coupling reproduction, male-female find each other and it all works from that point of view, sometimes that hybrid, the zygote that forms, won't ever be born, and there's no viability there. Even if it is born, like a mule here, the hybrid might be sterile, and that means that again there's no offspring. Sometimes there's a possibility in some organisms for the first generation to be fertile, but the subsequent generations aren't. So each of these things mean that we can define those species as ones that are incompatible for successful breeding with each other, whereas a species will successfully breed with other members of that species. So how do the species form? Well, this reproductive isolation is really a key part of it. So when we have two populations, let's go back, and they experience some sort of ecological or temporal separation. Perhaps one population ends up in two different habitats. That can create a reproductive isolation. So the ecological one starts things off, leading to a reproductive isolation. So they could breed with each other and it would still work out and make fertile offspring, but they just don't because they're in different locations. Over time, these two populations in the different locations will have separate gene pools therefore, and they might experience some genetic changes, which lead to some phenotypic changes, so that their behaviours or their look or their sound or their reproductive parts do not match up anymore, which leads to further reproductive isolation. And so sometimes we might start with an ecological isolation, but because those two populations then have genetic changes, then they might then experience temporal, behavioural, mechanical isolation from each other as well, leading eventually to so much genetic change that their hybrids, if they could form, would be sterile or inviable. So over time, what starts off as one population ends up as two populations with separate gene pools, and then as two separate species. And so we go from one species to two species by these processes. This can actually be shown experimentally to begin with fruit flies. So fruit flies are a really good lab animal because they reproduce very quickly and they have fairly simple genetics. If you have one population of fruit flies and you feed one lot starch and one lot maltose, which is a different type of sugar, you can have many generations. So they're being fed different diets and their genetic changes are happening and leading one to another, and they end up with perhaps a slightly different look. So they've been isolated geographically in two different locations, they're feeding on different foods and changing genetically and phenotypically along the way, so much so that their phenotype means that they look quite different to each other. And so the ones that were on starch, mostly we want to breed with other starch ones, and the ones that were on maltose will mostly want to breed with other maltose ones. And therefore these two populations have started to have a behavioural reproductive isolation as well as their initial geographic one. Even if you take the geographic away, they still have the behavioural isolation. And so if this continues over time, you can see how these could become two different species if they only mate with each other.